Ready.
So I'm here with the Bird Club in Southwest India. We just broke the world record for how many birds anybody has ever seen in 1 year. That is totally awesome. What do we say, guys?
Birds are the best!
Yes! Okay.
Thank you.
What we just saw there was a bunch of enthusiastic Kerala birders helping our guest today celebrate the breaking of a world record. He had just sighted a Sri Lankan frogmouth, and with that sighting, he had broken the world record for the maximum number of birds sighted in 1 year, which is called the big year of birding in birding parlance. So this was the celebration. Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. In this episode, we talk to Noah Strycker. Noah is the associate editor of Birding magazine and the author of several popular books about birds. He set the world record in 2015 by finding more than 6,000 species of birds in one calendar year, 6,042 to be precise. Noah has made more than 70 expeditions to Antarctica and the high Arctic, literally spreading the joy of birds from pole to pole. A more detailed bio will be posted in our show notes section. But for now, welcome, Noah, and thank you for talking to the Bird Podcast.
Hey, Shobha, thanks for having me.
So you're a hard man to reach because you travel so much, and you've just returned from Antarctica. So can you tell us about the work that you did there?
Yeah, that's right. I think I finally got back on the correct time zone. I just got back from Antarctica 2 days ago. I was there for most of the past 5 months, actually, in 2 separate seasons. First, I spent a month in November and December camping in a tent at an emperor penguin colony in the southern Weddell Sea in the middle of nowhere. And then I went back and spent another couple of months working on a ship that goes south from Argentina for a couple of weeks at a time, taking tourists to the Antarctic Peninsula. And it was a blast. It was a great season.
And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but from your PhD thesis, you've been very fascinated by penguins.
Oh, yeah. I've been fascinated by penguins for a long time. I first went to Antarctica right after my undergraduate. So I was 22 years old, got hired on a penguin research project as an intern and flew south with the US Antarctic program. So I went through New Zealand and then took an Air Force cargo jet and landed on the ice outside of McMurdo Station and got helicoptered out to this remote field camp and spent 3 months with 2 other researchers and didn't take a shower or anything. And we had 300,000 penguins outside and it was glorious. So ever since then, I've wanted to go back to Antarctica and have managed to go in different ways as a researcher and as a guide on tourist expeditions. But yeah, my master's thesis was on chinstrap penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula. You know, the black and white ones that have a little stripe right underneath their beak.
So why penguins?
Oh, why not penguins? I think everyone loves penguins. I mean, they're so endearing to us because they waddle around on land and they look so awkward. Although you kind of have to twist your mind, I think, when you're thinking about penguins. They're not really creatures of the land as much as the sea. They spend almost their entire lives in the ocean. So they're very elegant when they go in the water. And it's not really true that penguins can't fly because they do fly underneath the water. It's exactly the same. They flap their wings when they swim around. So yeah, I love penguins. I love everything about them. And having spent years studying them, I just enjoy every season more and more.
So for birders like me who haven't seen penguins in the wild, are there a few fascinating things about, besides the fact that they fly underwater? I mean, do they do something interesting, weird, strange? Any behaviors that you can spell out for us? Maybe 2 or 3.
Oh yeah, penguins are not like any other birds. I mean, everyone knows they can't fly, etc. But they live in the most extreme place in the world. Emperor penguins nest in Antarctica in the middle of winter when it's 70 degrees below 0 Celsius. I mean, it's like totally ridiculous, the things that penguins do. And so they have to be very well adapted. They have very dense feathers so that they can stay warm. They can dive way underneath the surface of the ocean. I think the record is 550 meters or so deep for an emperor penguin, swimming for more than half an hour at a time, holding its breath. So they do things that are sort of superhuman in many ways. If you dropped me in the middle of nowhere in Antarctica in the winter, I probably would not survive very long, but penguins do it pretty well.
um, you've written many books, including the National Geographic Birding Basics book, one which has tips, tools, and techniques for great bird watching. So we have, as you know, we have a thriving community of bird watchers in India and lots of beginners. So can you lay out some tips, tools, and techniques for our audience?
Well, I think it's pretty cool how bird watching has really taken flight just in the past, well, a decade or two, with the internet first coming along, and then digital photography and good field guides and binoculars and good equipment and access to information. But then more recently, over the worldwide pandemic, for a couple of years, everything was shut down except going outdoors. You could still do. And so there's been this huge surge in interest in birds around the world as a result of COVID, which I think is, maybe one benefit, I guess, of the crazy things we've done over the past couple of years. And so this book, Birding Basics, actually partly came out of that. National Geographic said, we need a book for all these new bird watchers who are going outside and trying to figure things out. And it was really fun for me to be able to go through and try to think about what are all the things you need to do to get started when you're just getting going, understanding birds, not just identifying them, but trying to figure out their behavior and watching things that they're doing, and just finding birds, where to go and who to meet, how to find other bird watchers, and listening to bird vocalizations. And there's so many different aspects of birding. I really love that about it. It's not just making a list of species. It's really appreciating this whole segment of life on Earth. I mean, that's a pretty broad subject.
So let me ask you specific questions, so is there a way that you need to have your presence in the forest in order to spot birds?
Yeah, I mean, going out fairly quietly and slowly so that you're paying attention, not just to what you're seeing around you, but what you're hearing around you, because birds are very vocal creatures as well, and they listen to each other. Going to established birding hotspots really helps. So places with some water, like a pond or a lake or a marsh or a wetland, tend to be really good places for bird watching, because you have different habitats overlapping each other. And so there's more birds to be found in those types of places. Getting yourself just a good pair of binoculars and a field guide that covers fairly comprehensively the birds that you can expect to see in your area. And not just getting that field guide, but actually opening it up and looking at it and trying to study it a little bit ahead of time to figure out what to expect. Because I think there's really no greater joy in life than looking for a bird that you have not seen, but you know what it is and where you can try to find it, and then finding it in that one moment. It's just like a treasure quest, and you found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's what keeps you going.
Jonathan Franzen, the author who we interviewed at the Bird Podcast, said that one thing he does is that he memorizes the field guide by literally calling out the different ID characteristics. How do you must have a prodigious memory? How do you remember things, especially with respect to birding?
Well, I think it's best to start close to home in your own backyard. You're not dealing with a whole lot of species, generally speaking, just outside your window, but you'll have some birds around no matter where you live. Birds live everywhere. And so start with those ones. Those are your closest, nearest neighbors. Those are the birds that you can get to know the best because they're around you all the time. And then you can start venturing out a little farther from home, going to the local park or birding hotspot or wherever. But I think getting to know birds, for me, is in many ways similar to getting to know people. You walk into a room of people you've never met before. Some of them are really loud and colorful, and they jump out at you right away, and you get to know them very quickly. And some of them are a little more shy and quiet and maybe not so just obvious to look at. But when you get to talking to them and and getting to know them a little deeper, then often those are the most interesting ones to get to know. So I like to think of birds in those terms sometimes, like getting to know different personalities.
And tools, binoculars would be it, I think, for a starting birder, right? I mean, tips you've given, but the tools would be basically, do you do a notebook? Or, I mean, eBird is what you said in your book, and then a good pair of binoculars. Yeah, yeah. And the techniques, like you said, going out in the field or in the backyard as much as you can and getting to know the ecosystem. Anything else you
Yeah, that is the great beauty about birding is, technically speaking, it does not require any equipment at all. You don't even really need a pair of binoculars to watch birds. You could just walk outside with your eyeballs or even just your ears and appreciate the birds around you. Of course, it can go from there. You get a pair of binoculars and then a field guide, and then you want a camera with a long lens to take photos of birds, and then you might want a spotting scope with a tripod so you can look at birds farther away on lakes and beaches and that kind of thing. And then you go down the road of audio recording bird sounds and buying a parabolic dish that you can hear a bird in a tree a mile away and recognize it. You can get more specialized equipment, but really the basics are just a good pair of binoculars and a field guide, and you're good to go.
Yeah. In 2015, you traveled with a 40-liter backpack and just a pair of binoculars, if I read it right, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. I did my whole big year of birding around the world with all of my stuff fit in a backpack that was small enough to put under the seat of an airplane.
We'll come to that because that's the meat of the interview, and I say that as a vegetarian. but let's talk about your book, about feathers and what birds can teach us about being human. For people who haven't read the book, can you just lay out the thesis of the book and some salient points?
Oh, sure. Yeah, this was my first real big book project in 2014. I wrote this book called The Thing with Feathers, and it's all about bird behavior. So there's 13 chapters. Each one focuses on a bird behavior that I thought was interesting, that I maybe had experience with in the field. So like there's a chapter on starling flocks and how they all manage to not bump into each other and fall out of the sky when they fly around like a big tornado. And there's a chapter on magpies have been apparently shown to recognize their own reflection in a mirror. So what does that mean for bird self-awareness? And can other birds recognize themselves? Not so much, as far as we can tell. And yeah, there's just other interesting chapters about hummingbirds and albatrosses and penguins and other cool birds around the world and things that they do. But while I was researching these various bird behaviors, it was impossible not to think about them in terms of comparing them to ourselves. And that's a good way of understanding birds, but also appreciating them. And almost everything that birds do has some kind of parallel to human behaviors, whether it's wanting to leave a legacy or have a personality or experience thoughts and feelings and emotions, which I think birds totally do. They're more similar to us in many ways than we often like to think.
So the author Jennifer Ackerman says birds are genius, but you are saying, you're the first one who said on the podcast they experience feelings and emotions. So why do you say that?
Oh, well, I think anyone who has ever had a pet animal in their house gets to know that animal as an individual. Doesn't matter what it is, a dog, a cat, a gerbil, a bird. And if you spend enough time with birds like other animals as individuals, I think it becomes pretty clear that not all birds are the same. It's just that we don't experience them as individuals very often, because when we go birding, we see them out in the forest and you see a wild bird and then it flies away. So you don't get to know it on that deep level. But the work I've done with birds in captivity in the past, like I spent a whole summer captive breeding endangered Hawaiian birds on the big island of Hawaii to try to build up their population and release them back into the wild eventually. So we were feeding these birds in aviaries every day for months at a time. And they were all different. Some of them were really chatty and would come up to you as soon as you went into their aviary. Some of them would lurk off in a corner somewhere. Some of them ate a lot. Some of them didn't eat so much. birds on nesting studies that I've studied in the past. Some of them are really good parents and super attentive, and they'll raise their chicks every time. And some of them are super lazy and they don't really bring a lot of food back to their chicks. And so, like, all these sort of stereotypes, I suppose, that we think about ourselves can also sort of be applied to birds in many ways. And so I think there's more going on in those bird brains of theirs than people often really consciously think about.
Yeah. I mean, you are into conservation, and it always comes up in the podcast. So, and you've been to some of the farthest places in the world, so you probably have a bird's eye view of it. And can you tell us your thoughts on conservation, climate change, sustainability, all of those?
Well, bird conservation, that's a huge topic. But I will say, when I did my big year in 2015, I went to 41 countries in 1 year, spent the whole year just looking at birds and meeting the people who were interested in them and working with them in different places along the way. So it was kind of like taking this snapshot perspective in one trip of the state of birds on Earth. And when I got to the end, I was struck by, of course, how many conservation issues birds are facing in so many different places. There's never been so much pressure on bird survival on Earth, just all the ways that we're affecting them. But also, at the same time, never have so many people cared about birds in such enthusiastic ways in all of human history. And never has there been such a concerted idea about conserving them. And I actually came away fairly optimistic. I think, yeah, there's terrible things happening to certain bird populations, and we have resources to combat many of those conservation challenges. But it's something that we're thinking about, and we're sort of past this period in human history where it was all about just exploiting nature, and now I think we're starting to realize that it is really something on its own that we should conserve for its own sake, and I love that.
So you talked just now about the big year of birding, and can you tell us some of the birds that fascinated you during that trip and why?
Oh my gosh, in South America, I really wanted to see this bird called a harpy eagle. I don't know if you've ever heard of a harpy eagle. It's the biggest raptor in the Western Hemisphere anyway. It's huge. It's several feet tall. It flies around very remote jungles in South America, eating monkeys and sloths as its main diet. They'll carry off a 20-pound howler monkey, pick it off from a treetop, and take it back to their nest and rip it up and feed it to their chick. I mean, it's like vicious. But when you see a harpy eagle up close, they're also spectacular. They have this big crest on top of their head and a black band across their chest. And when they open their wings, they're super broad so that they can navigate through closed canopy jungles. And they have legs that are as big around as your wrist. And when they open up their talons, the circumference is about the same as a dinner plate. Like, they're huge. So I wanted to see a harpy eagle. And when I got to central Brazil, I met a birder there who picked me up from the airport and said, hey, we've got a harpy eagle nest staked out. We're going to go tomorrow before dawn and see if we can find it, if it flies in, which he never should have told me because I didn't sleep at all that entire night. I just lay in bed until 4 a.m., like thinking about if we were going to find this eagle. And the next morning we drove out to this spot and hiked in, and sure enough, there's this nest in the top of a tree that's the size of a bus, like massive construction of sticks. And then we waited for 5 hours and did not see anything. We just stared at this nest all morning. And meanwhile, it's my big year. Like, I need to see 17 new birds a day to make it to my goal. So I'm looking at my watch like, well, we should really be moving on, but I want to see this eagle. And finally, we got up to leave at lunchtime. And of course, just as we turned around to walk off, that was the moment that the male harpy eagle picked to swoop in right over our heads and perch on a branch right in front of us and just devour this coati, a raccoon-like South American animal. And so we stayed another hour and watched it. And that was one of the most amazing bird experiences anywhere of my entire life.
And then you talk about birds I'd never heard about in that book. That chapter I loved, by the way, the sandpiper plover. That was your first bird, and you went and it was right at your feet with a chick right behind it. Yeah, and then you begin by saying that uh, you saw a Cape petrel first, and thank God it wasn't a skua or a gull. So I again, the chapter and the premonition of it. But just for people who haven't read that book, why not a skua or a gull?
Well, nothing against skuas, but skuas in the Antarctic, they take the place of eagles and hawks. They're the main predator in Antarctica on land. Like they murder baby penguins for a living. And so a skua would have been cool in its own right, but I was quite happy to see a Cape petrel because they are a somewhat more gentle bird. And I felt like that was a good omen for things to come for the rest of the year.
Yeah. And then you went to Africa, and you've said that Uganda is a great place for a diversity of species. Any African species that particularly caught your fancy?
Oh, well, speaking of Uganda, there's a bird there called the shoebill, like a shoe. And have you seen a picture of a shoebill? They're such a weird looking bird. They have a beak that looks like a wooden clog attached to their face. And they're found out in big marshes in Central Africa with floating mats of vegetation.
Sorry, Noah. We interviewed Judith Mirembe, who's based in Uganda, and her episode was about
lovely.
the shoebill. Yeah, so she showed us photographs on conservation of shoebills and everything. But so yeah, we have, and then which is why I'm sort of moving you to Peru, where you transversed everywhere, it looks like, and saw so many birds that one would hope to see at some point. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, Peru was also spectacular. I mean, I think I saw more species of birds in Peru during my big year than any other country along the way. I could have done that in Colombia or Ecuador or maybe Brazil as well if I'd spent more time in those countries. Those four are all up there together. But I spent the time in Peru partly because there was this half crazy local birder there named Gunnar who took me around, and we had some various adventures and misadventures along the way. But it was well worth it because we saw so many spectacular and endemic species of birds, and just the sheer diversity in that part of the world is off the scale. I mean, people ask me sometimes, well, why didn't you go to the Galapagos during your big year? There's so many birds there. Well, yeah, there are some cool birds in the Galapagos. There's maybe 50 species or so, but compare that to Peru has almost 2,000 species of birds. And so you could spend a lifetime in Peru and not see them all. However fun it might be to try.
Tell us about, you're based in India, so tell us about Indian birds. And you were in Kerala, and that was such a funny chapter. But tell us about India.
In Kerala going up to the tea plantations up in the hills, and we saw a bird called a great hornbill up there, which is not endemic to India. It's found throughout parts of Asia. But that was where I first saw my first one. And I thought it was such an impressive creature, a great hornbill. They're huge. They have this massive beak, and they have big wings, and they're colorful, and they have this black and white pattern. And I just remember this great hornbill sitting up in a tree in this tea plantation near sunset. It was the end of a day, and just thinking, this is awesome.
Yeah. As you talk, I usually ask every guest, what are your favorite species? But as you talk, I'm thinking you've seen so many species that I have to ask you, which categories of birds do you like? Because it looks like you've seen so many. So you take your pick. I mean, which are your favorite species, or which type of or category of birds do you like?
Well, I am partial to penguins because I have some history studying penguins in Antarctica. But I usually say, and this is not without many hours of thought over the course of my life, because people ask what your favorite bird is. So you've got to have a good answer. And my favorite bird in the whole world is actually the turkey vulture, which lives all over North, Central, and South America. It's very common. It's the common local vulture in most places. You know, like the classic buzzard sitting on a cactus with a bare head waiting for something to die. That's the turkey vulture. And I just think they are such underappreciated, fascinating, and sort of elegant and well-mannered birds, as strange as that might sound. When I was in high school, I was inspired by an episode of a David Attenborough TV show called Life of Birds to go out and find a roadkill deer carcass and put it in the trunk of my car and take it home and see how many turkey vultures I could attract. And ever since then, I have just loved turkey vultures.
And in one of your interviews, you specify why you like them. Can you repeat that? For example, you say what goes in is antibiotics, what comes out is steroid, something like that. Or
oh, well, turkey vultures eat dead flesh. So they have to be able to digest this stuff without getting sick. And so they've developed a cast iron stomach. They can eat just about anything, even anthrax or disease or various really virulent things. And then by the time it goes through a vulture's digestive system and comes out the back end, it is sterile. So you could use turkey vulture excrement as hand sanitizer if you really wanted to. And they kind of do, actually. They poop down their own legs on hot days, partly to cool themselves down through evaporation, but also partly, I think, just to sterilize their toes after they've been walking around on diseased animal carcasses all day long.
I've read that. I've read your book, but can you describe why you flew in from Australia to India for your last bird sighting? Because I think that whole chapter describes this whole process of birding without borders.
The end of my big year, I had planned out, my original goal was to find 5,000 birds by the end of the year. And I surpassed that in the Philippines in October with a couple months to spare. So I kept on going, of course. And by the time Christmas rolled around, I was in Australia and I was up to, I think at the end of Christmas Day, I had seen 5,960 birds or so. So I still needed to find 40 more if I was going to make it to 6,000, which it would be kind of criminal to come so close and not quite get to that next big round number. And I remember my host I was staying with in Perth, Australia, this guy, Frank, we sat down and had Christmas dinner together and went through a list of every bird I hadn't seen in Australia over a couple of hours and decided that it just wasn't possible with a few days. Maybe if I had a few weeks, but not, the distances are just too big to be able to zip around and pick them off one by one. So then it was like, where in the world could I go on short notice and try to get 40 more species that I haven't found yet? And fortunately that year I was using eBird, which is this global database of bird sightings that hundreds of thousands of birders are using now. And it was very useful. They had just come out with a new feature in 2015 called Target Species, which will filter all the sightings reported from any given region of the world against your own personal list. And it will tell you what birds to expect in a certain area that you have not yet seen. So that was pretty cool because it meant I could run that for a bunch of different places and calculate where I had the best chance of getting 40 more species. And that turned out to be Assam in Northeast India. And so some kind of fancy footwork with getting visas at the last minute and everything else, I ended up flying from Southern Australia straight to Northeast India for the last couple of days of the year, right before New Year, to try to close it out with getting 40 more birds to get to 6,000.
And the honey eater was your last bird, or the
yes, the yellow-rumped honey guide. What a bird! It is like pretty endemic to that region, only at a certain elevational range. And as I understand, a very specific habitat as well. They're usually found next to vertical rock faces that have active honeybee hives attached. So like really specific habitat. So I was pretty happy to see that one as bird number 6,000. I just remember we were in this dusty road in the Himalayan foothills, me and 3 other young Indian birders, a couple of whom had flown out from Delhi to help me out for the last couple of days of the year, and just jumping up and down, so happy that we'd seen this yellow-rumped honey guide for bird number 6,000. That was the 29th of December.
And you also saw a bay owl uh, that was unusual for India.
Yeah, that's right. That far northeast corner of India, you have a chance at seeing an oriental bay owl, which is this small owl with a nice flat heart-shaped face. I had seen one earlier in the year in Borneo, where they're kind of supposed to be. So it wasn't a new bird for me, but we spotlighted this bay owl and I snapped a photo of it at about 11 o'clock p.m. on New Year's Eve. And then this guy Ramit was standing next to me and he was like, do you realize this is probably the first photograph that has ever been taken of a wild oriental bay owl anywhere in the country of India? And I was like, okay, that's it. That is my last bird. And that was the end of my big year.
What are your upcoming projects? What are you going to do in this next year?
Well, after my big year finished up, I wrote the book about it, Birding Without Borders. And then after that, that sort of led into the next thing, which was, well, now I've gone around the world and seen all these birds and traveled. I'd like to spend a long time studying one bird for an extended period of time and see how much I can learn about it. So that turned into my thesis about chinstrap penguins in Antarctica. I finished that up in 2021. And now I work as associate editor of Birding Magazine in the US. That's a part-time job. I also work in Antarctica and in the northern Arctic as well for a month or two each season as an onboard guide and ornithologist and give presentations on small expedition ships visiting those areas. And in between, do other writing projects. So Birding Basics just came out a few months ago, and now I'm getting started on a new book project for National Geographic, which will probably take most of the rest of this year and probably a little beyond. And it's a pretty open-ended one, and it's probably going to be something about bird behavior, and it's probably going to be fairly large format with a lot of illustrations and text, and I'm pretty excited about it. And so that's my next big project.
Which countries would you recommend for people to go to, not to rack up species lists, but just people who are interested in birds?
Well, that's the thing. You hit it right there, that birding is not just about racking up species, but it's the whole experience of being in an amazing place, watching birds, usually with other people with you. And so it's the whole adventure is what makes birding interesting to me anyway. So with that in mind, I think my favorite birding spots that I've been have been in no particular order. Ecuador, you have an amazing diversity of habitats in a small area, and the birding experience is really nice there because there's lots of nice lodges to stay at, and it's safe to travel around, and the food's pretty good. Oaxaca, Mexico, I would highly recommend as a birding destination. Also just a great place to travel. Also really good food there.
How do you spell
Southern
Oaxaca?
India, Oaxaca, Oaxaca. It's a state in Mexico, in South Central Mexico. Southern India also makes my list. I just loved in Kerala. Okay, so you go birding and then you get really hungry and you sit down at a roadside food stand and they put a banana leaf on your table and then they start putting food on the banana leaf for you to eat and all these different small assortments and very spicy, and you don't have any utensils, so you have to eat it with one hand, which was like totally new for me, and I was terrible at it, and food was running down my arm the whole time, and it was delicious. It was so good. It was so good. Oh my gosh, I would go back there and eat myself silly anytime.
Ecuador, Oaxaca, Southern India. Also parts of?
Okay, so Ecuador, Oaxaca, Southern India. I'll give you two more. I'll give you Southern Turkey. I also really enjoyed, not on the birding map at all, but a good diversity of birds there and just amazing landscapes that hardly anyone ever sees. I happened to be there actually during the height of the ISIS occupation in northern Syria. And so I was just a couple kilometers away from the Syrian border when that was happening. My local birding contact in Turkey was like, hey, you want to go see the ISIS flag? And I was like, no, that's terrible. I don't want to see the ISIS flag. I want to see a babbler. So I guess we could laugh about it, but it was interesting. But the landscape there was incredible. And then the last one that I would pick would be probably different parts of Australia. Just again, the huge landscapes there. I'm a pretty big fan of wide open, desolate spaces in general, and deserts and those kinds of places. And Australia just it's not too busy, except there's lots of wildlife there to experience. And I really enjoyed birding there.
And the last question, Noah, would be for anyone who wants to follow in your footsteps, any advice that you might have for them?
Well, I will say I never really set out to be a birder as a career. It's just something I've always been interested in. I got interested in birds when I was in 5th grade because my teacher put a bird feeder on our classroom window and stopped class every time a new bird showed up. And then it just kind of went from there, and it's been a slippery slope. So I got more and more addicted to watching birds and just continued pursuing that interest in different ways throughout high school and college. A couple of things I would recommend for people going through the educational system. First of all, I took a year off in between high school and college. Before I started college, I took a whole year, a gap year, if you want to call it that, and went and worked at a wildlife refuge, and I was an intern at a research station in Panama working on a project with bird nests. And I took a painting class that year and went to a birding convention. And it was just really helpful to have that year before I jumped into college to know that, yes, this is what I really want to do. And then once I got to college, studied biology, and every summer worked on different internship projects with birds. And then once I graduated with my undergraduate, then I was like, oh my gosh, I could just keep doing this and start writing about birds and traveling and all the rest of it. So yeah, it was like, it wasn't something I set out to do as a job. It's just that I've been very passionate about it and have fallen into these different niches where it's become a career for me. So I feel very fortunate that way. So for people with a budding interest in birds who want to do it professionally, my advice would be follow that interest rather than trying to like make money off of it and see what happens. And
So,
as for traveling the world, I would say for any kind of traveler, but especially when you're looking at birds, keep an open mind when you go to different places. Take a couple of things that are very useful to you. I found my most useful item when I was traveling was a spoon in my back pocket because you never know when you're going to need one. But don't travel too heavy because traveling with one carry-on backpack the whole year was so freeing. You have no idea when you don't have to worry about your big bag of luggage that you're dragging behind you everywhere you go. You're so much more lightweight and nimble and just free to be out and about in the world. Make friends. Try to learn a couple of words in the local language everywhere that you go. I was terrible at that. I'd like forget them 2 minutes later, but I'd always try. And study the birds ahead of time a little bit before you get to each place so that you know a little bit about what to expect. So you're not just totally starting from scratch, because I think it's more fun to appreciate things when you know a little bit about them first and then you go see them. And have fun, interact with some local people wherever you go. I had this idea for a while that maybe I should have it be a self-found big year and find all the birds by myself, but I quickly realized how impractical that is, first of all, and how much less fun it would be if you're not meeting the people who really live in all of these different places, and how much more that adds to your experience. I found in the end, after all was said and done in the big year, the memories that have stuck with me the most from it were the people I met along the way, the other birders who were also really passionate about the same things that I was passionate about, and the adventures that we had together when we were out there searching for all these birds.
Two things. So you just carried 2 sets of clothes. What do you personal effects were very minimal, I'm assuming, if you pack in a backpack. And then you hand wash like we
Most
do
of
in
the
India.
year, most of the year I traveled in places that were fairly warm. So I didn't have to take a lot of big jackets and things, which would have taken up a lot more room.
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah, I took like 3 pairs of underpants and 2 pairs of pants and maybe 3 t-shirts and a couple of other items, but that was pretty lightweight. And it helped because I could wash some of those things in a sink and maybe wear some of them for multiple days without washing them. There was a review of my book in the journal Nature, which is like the highest scientific journal in the bird world. And the person who reviewed my book actually called me smelly in the review. So I take that as a point of pride that I've been called smelly in the highest scientific journal in the land.
Do you think big ears are over, or people are going to just keep doing them?
I think people will keep doing big ears. It's been such a tradition in the birding world for decades and decades now. And it's so fun. You don't have to do a big ear worldwide. You can do one in your own backyard, or you can do a big ear in your home county or your home city or your home park, or you could do a big ear just to birds you photograph, or you could do a big ear of birds that you hear and don't see, there's so many different variations on how you could approach a big ear that I think as birding evolves over time, the big ear will evolve as well. There has been one other person to beat my record already, so I'm not even the record holder anymore for the world big ear, and I think that's pretty cool that you could inspire someone else to take up the reins and find ways to take it in new and interesting directions.
Any last words before we close, Noah?
Oh, it's just been so fun chatting with you, Shobha, and it makes me remember the awesome time I had birding in India. I want to go back. I want to come back and spend more time in India.
Do that.
As many
Oh
other
yeah,
places, I just had a few days. So
oh yeah, I'm sorry. I remembered. I looked up all the people in India that you were with, like Harsha, for example. A lot of them have become bird guides. And would you recommend that as for people who are passionate about birding and just want to pursue it? Would guiding be the way to go? Absolute last question.
yeah, sure. If you're interested in showing people around who are visiting your area, birding is a really nice way to do it because it gives you a way to connect with the world around you. And people are so excited when they see new birds that it's almost as fun to show someone a bird that they've never seen before as it is to see a life bird yourself. I really like that when people come to where I live, taking them out to the places that I know really well and seeing their excitement. So yeah, being a bird guide, it's like the opposite of being a dentist. When you're a dentist, it's a great profession, but everyone who comes to see you, they don't really want to be there. They want to get away as fast as they can. Bird watching is the opposite. When people come to you to go birding, they're having the greatest time.
You're an optimistic person. I love that. Thank you. So thank you so much, Noah, for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening. Bye.